Energy demands continue to increase. Everything from AI data centers looking to be good grid citizens to homeowners looking to manage their electricity bills with home energy management. We have an opportunity to look at ways that we can make energy more resilient and efficient. And so with that, we're here with Harold Jones, our Chief Sustainability Officer, to talk about the importance of energy efficiency and sustainability, how it's not just operational, but strategic. Welcome to the conversation, Harold.
Thank you, Zari. Good to be with you.
So tell me first, we'd like to start with, what does a Chief Sustainability Officer do? Give me a day in the life of Harold.
That's a very broad question, but let me try to break it down into a few pieces. First of all, the CSO role sits between what a company does, what it believes about itself, and what society expects from a company and what the company does. So in my role, what I do is understand what Eaton produces, which is making power management solutions and products, and then how those products are used in the service of society. Eaton has a powerful, compelling story. For over 100 years, we know how to manage energy and to deliver energy safely, efficiently, and reliably. Guess what? The world is in a place where energy demand is growing faster than we've ever imagined. Today, there are roughly 9 billion people on Earth. That number is going to grow by estimates to something like 11 billion. But that is not the big issue here. What it is that all 9 billion people growing to 11 want to have higher standards of living. Right. They want their microwaves to work. They want to fly on jet planes. They want everything to be more electric. And that is creating an enormous amount of demand on the energy grid globally, which by itself is old, that needs to be replaced.
Right.
And we're putting new requirements, especially through AI, on the grid. So my job is to work with our teams to understand what our customers need, what products we're putting in the marketplace, and then also to bridge the gap between how society really thinks about energy and climate change, and the things that affect things like overheating, overcooling, and all the things that we're kind of experiencing even right now.
And so how do we at Eaton think about sustainability and energy efficiency as core to the work that we do?
Well, everything we do, if you're going to manage energy, you got to think about it. Number one, it has to be safe.
Right.
If it's not safe, you can't use it. You can't imagine someone touching a wire and going kaboom. So that's not in play. It has to be reliable, but it also has to be efficient. And efficiency simply means that you're using energy appropriately. It's optimized for cost, for delivery, for impact. So when we think about efficiency, it's a broader topic. It's really about the right amount of energy in the right way with as little waste as possible. Now, the other side of the equation is energy does cost money. We make energy through whether it's solar, renewables, or even coal power. It costs money to produce energy. And so efficiency goes to how do you optimize your cost?
Okay.
The cost of production, the cost of use, especially from a consumer perspective.
So when we think about the cost angle, oftentimes when we think about energy efficiency, we think about cost cutting or trimming costs, but it really comes down to being even more about resiliency. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of resiliency for our customers, but also for us?
Well, you could take that in a number of ways, but let's think of it this way. I recently acquired a hybrid vehicle and I plug it in and the system informs me, Harold, your best window for charging is between 11 o'clock and 3 a.m. Why does it tell me that? Well, that is when most people are sleeping, presumably. Some people don't sleep very well, but that's when most people are sleeping and the energy demand on the grid is down. And so the entire production system, if you would, how energy is produced, you're doing it in a manner that optimizes everything from the supply chain all the way through delivery in your home. So efficiency is really about the wise and effective use of money, energy, and time. That's what you're trying to do. It's about effectiveness and efficiency, which translates to cost reduction, right? And by the way, as populations continue to grow, as we continue to spend more energy, you're actually using potentially more energy, but you're doing it in a much more cost-effective way, thus the word efficiently.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what we're trying to do globally. Now, when you think about some parts of the world where there's no energy just yet, putting energy on the grid in the parts of sub-Saharan Africa and places like that, that's a different equation we're solving therefore, which is that you want to bring power as reliably and as safely as possible. That this is in contrast to shall we say, the Western world, where we have grids, albeit they're growing older, but there's so much more demand on the grid right now. And utilities and power management companies are fighting that upward climb.
Mm-hmm.
How do they create more energy or produce more energy and do it as efficiently as possible without, let's say, 1 + 2 has to be less than 1 or 2, if you would.
Mm-hmm. So when we think about all of the increased demand on the grid, what are the things that we're doing to work with customers to better leverage our technologies to help make better use of energy?
Well, the first thing is we're very closely coupled with our customers. Our teams, we have, and I can speak for our electrical sector utility teams, and we're very tuned in to the challenge they have, how much power they need to produce, the regulatory frameworks around power generation, where you can create power, where you can't, and all of those kinds of things. So I think the first step is getting very intimately understanding of what our customers do, how they do it, and the challenges they have. And then we work, in some cases, co-create solutions with them for the best solutions, whether it's switchgear, all the way through AI systems that monitor grid efficiency and power delivery. Mm-hmm. So the way we work with customers, I think, is a really bit of Eaton's secret sauce, which is really walk in the customer's shoes, understand, in some cases, actually understanding the customer better than they understand their own world, so that we can help them solve problems that in some cases they are not even aware of. Now, also, because we're a global company, we can connect best practices from anywhere to anywhere. We can see things happening in Europe, in Germany, and places like that, or in Texas, where there's a huge production of renewable energies, and we can apply those learnings across the globe. In California, as we unfortunately have learned, wildfires have created a problem. Right. Guess what? Now we understand how to deal with resiliency with wildfires, having our underground power systems and so forth, which we're now leveraging to other parts of the world with such risk in terms of fire. And
we're also looking at AI to help us mitigate wildfire risk, right? So how are we building AI into our products to help us better understand when the circumstances might be ripe for a wildfire, and how do we stop it before it starts?
Yeah, that's a really exciting area. I'm going to confess I'm not an expert on it. But what I think Eaton has done over the years is to really understand, if you would, the fingerprint of power, or the power genome. For some of the folks on listening to us who understand or know Shazam, we can essentially create a signature for a particular kind of wave. So for example, if a wire goes down because of a lightning arc or something, we can isolate that. We can define the signature of it. If we have a power fault, depending on the fault, we've developed these algorithms all through AI and some very sophisticated thinking our Center for Intelligent Power has been working on. So AI, coupled with our multi-years of experience with some extremely bright Eaton engineers, we're now able to really understand power almost like an individual. We know the signature. Maybe stepping away from the grid for a moment, relatively recently, we spent some time thinking about how power behaves in, let's say, an elderly person's home. When you open the refrigerator, it has a signature. When you open your garage door, it has a signature. We can essentially, through AI and other algorithms, understand the living pattern of a person and intervene. For example, if someone is supposed to show up for a doctor's appointment at 10 o'clock every Tuesday, every quarter, and they don't,
we may be able to see that. The garage door doesn't open.
The garage door doesn't open. We may be able to see that.
Right.
So AI is playing a critical part of the work we're doing. But the work itself, the algorithms and the intelligence is coming from years and years and years of, again, I say some really super smart, you know who you guys are out there at Eaton, who are leading the edge on some very sophisticated thinking, and AI is helping all of that.
Can we talk a little bit about why we think this shift in demand and expectation is happening now?
Well, for a number of reasons. With the proliferation of AI and I'm not going to get this right, the experts will tell us that a graphical processing unit, GPU, versus a CPU, the GPUs are much more efficient in terms of the way they run, but they also use a lot more power.
Yeah.
Right? Everybody has AI something on their phone. It's now everywhere. I recently got a notification to go to an AI Excel class.
Okay.
So Excel is going to do AI and all of that. More and more of us are using AI for nearly everything. And so the power demand for AI is continuing to grow. Concurrently, the grid itself that supports power distribution, most grids around the world are 50, nearly 100 years old.
Right.
They need to be retrofitted. They need to be modernized. Think of a highway system that has not been updated for 50 years with all kinds of potholes and so on, and then putting super 2026 cars on these roads.
Driving a Lamborghini on that road isn't going to feel very good.
No, it's not going to feel very good, but some people are doing it, right? And so we're solving old problems and new problems at the same time. And essentially, that's why we talk about this energy supercycle at Eaton, where we're seeing the convergence of such a demand for power management solutions that we've never seen before. In fact, we say, and we heard our CEO, Paolo, recently say that whatever we make, we can sell. Our revenue is limited by our production, so to speak. And that is what is driving all of this. There's just so much demand in the world right now, and while we retrofit systems. And so when you look at projections from the International Energy Association and so forth, that growth is huge, and we're just at the beginning of it. I'd say that we're probably not even 10% into the climb. And so what people are perceiving as enormous power demands now is going to be 10x before the story is finished.
So there's a lot of work companies like ours have to do in order to meet that demand. And part of that is, how do we do those things more efficiently, more effectively, and more sustainably? Right. So can we talk a little bit about how we connect, how we think about efficiency to also what we think about in terms of sustainability, and not just from a green perspective, but sustainability of companies, right? We see new companies starting all of the time, especially in this big demand. How do we think about energy efficiency? How do we think about sustainability in terms of the long-term possibilities for a company?
Yeah, let me give a high-level perspective on that question. I think we really have to think about energy as sort of the engine that drives business, and it drives ultimate societal prosperity. We recognize collectively that we are a society that needs more things. Everybody, let me back up for a second. In the United States, we have 300 million people. In China, with about 1 billion people, about 30% of them qualify as pure middle class. Imagine an entire nation having discretionary income to buy whatever they want.
Yeah.
China's just one example. India's coming along quickly. Behind them are countries like Indonesia, Nigeria, and other parts of the world. The amount of demand the world needs with respect to energy is something we can't even begin to think about. And so having efficiency as the driver that connects what we can produce and do safely and sustained over time is what we're solving for. I tell people the ultimate solution is to decouple greenhouse gases from energy demand.
Okay, tell me a little bit more what you mean by that.
That means that if we step away from fossil fuels, which produce greenhouse gases, or we're able to sequester or capture carbon from the environment, or go to purely renewable sources, we can decouple carbon from economic growth. That is the solution I think most people are looking for. Now, practically, we're not going to get out of carbon anytime soon.
Right.
So we have to have solutions like sequestration, forestation, and things like that. There are also technologies like what they call geoengineering, where you'll spray reflective material into the atmosphere to reduce the amount of sunlight that impacts the earth. So you can actually cool the earth differently. And so there are technologies like that that, again, decouple energy from emissions. And so there's a whole body of work and science being done in all kinds of crazy places. That's not where we play, but we watch that very carefully to see what is happening. Sequestration technologies, like essentially piping carbon from the environment, concentrating it and doing deep well injection into the ground and things like that. These are things that are being looked at. Or taking carbon and actually converting it into a fuel in the environment. So you're actually not adding, the delta is zero as
Okay.
you introduce carbon into the environment. These are all the kinds of things that are being looked at. And so part of my team and part of the work we do is to watch, to understand. Now, what Eaton is doing specifically in that space, there's something called a virtual power purchase agreement, a
Mhm.
VPPA. What VPPAs do is you essentially underwrite the creation of renewable power. You may not use it directly, but it's additive to the global grid. So you're
Okay.
effectively removing carbon out of the system by intentionally underwriting financially renewables onto the system.
So it's how do we add more renewable power
Yes.
to help offset some of the increase that we're seeing, even though we understand that we're long ways away from being totally renewable.
Absolutely. And that's why we use terms like energy addition.
Mhm.
We need more energy than sources can produce. Relatively recently, we did a trip with some of our business folks to Kenya in Eastern Africa. 97% of all Kenyan power is from wind
Mhm.
because they have a mountain range that can effectively capture it. And so that's as renewable as it gets. And we're looking at multiple systems like geothermal,
Mhm.
wind, hydro systems. And so all of these things add to the grid power because there's so much power requirement that coal alone cannot produce.
Right.
So these are the ways in which we're thinking about efficiency in terms of not only the use, but the generation and distribution.
Mhm. So it's how do we think about, I love that term energy addition. And we've started talking about
Right.
that more at Eaton, right? It's not just about what you take away, but it's about what we're adding into our toolbox of options for energy generation.
Well, absolutely. Look, in the sustainability world, there have been, shall we say, periods where we go deep on something. We're going to go 100% renewables. We're going to have high,
Mhm.
electric vehicles and so forth. All of those are wonderful ideas. And those concepts have moved society forward in a lot of different positive, unique ways.
Right.
But again, when you look at the pure math and you look at how much energy the world needs, we need all
And how quickly
kinds,
we need it.
we need all kinds of energy,
Yeah.
at least in the ways in which you can do it safely and efficiently. I mean, you could power a city with solar, but that's a large field,
Mhm.
right, of solar panels someplace.
And what does that do to the environment?
There are positives and negatives to
Absolutely.
it. Look,
To everything.
when it comes to the environment, there's always a put and a take.
Yeah.
My own calculus is the puts have to exceed the takes. It has to be net positive.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
that's the solution set that I think makes sustainable sense for the long run.
Mm-hmm. And that's, I think, the really interesting thing, right? I think oftentimes the word sustainability gets caught up in just the environmental piece of it, but talking about sustained growth, so using it more in that way than the word sustainability, I do think adds a different take on how are we building products, how are we looking at innovation and technology to help sustain the increased demand, right? Or to help sustain companies or to help sustain people in their everyday lives.
Well, let me give you an absurd example. I'm not sure if this will make our reel or not, but let's try it. Some years ago, a company decided to make an eternal light bulb,
Mm-hmm.
and a light bulb that would never burn out. And they sold a lot of them.
Okay.
But after they sold them, they didn't sell any more. Guess what? The company went bankrupt.
Mm-hmm.
It was not sustainable.
Mm-hmm.
So when we talk about sustainability, I use 4 letters. It has to be financially sustainable.
Right.
You have to exist to be sustainable.
Mm-hmm.
It has to be environmentally sustainable. It has to be socially sustainable. And you have to have a governance structure that is sustainable. Let me do the G side first, the governance bit.
Mm-hmm.
If you're not ethical, and we talk about ethics a lot, ethics is simply the way a company behaves in society.
Right.
If you're not an ethical company, you will not make it. That is part of sustainability. And that is why our board of directors invites me, Paolo, at least once a year to talk about what we're doing in this field.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the G part. We've talked about the E part. We talked about the F part. What is social? A lot of the materials we use in electronics, sophisticated metals that are
Mm-hmm.
mined from parts of the world where young people or people are in mines experiencing all kinds of noxious chemicals.
Mhm.
The lifespan of some of these people is not good. They develop illnesses and diseases very early in life. That has a social consequence to it.
Right.
Ultimately, those things also impact the sustainability of a company. So when we think about sustainability, financial for sure, F, environment, E, S, social, and governance. You have to think about all three dimensions. And that is why me, as Eaton CSO personally, I'm really grateful that I have a company where ethics is not something in question.
Right.
We do right by people. We have safety practices in our shops. We do not allow our people to overwork or work long hours without rest periods and so
Right.
forth. We actually care about the well-being of our people. We care about the environment and those kinds of things. That is the foundation of sustainability.
And that's how we make decisions at this company.
Right. And companies who don't do FESG right don't last very long.
Right. So you mentioned resources.
Yep.
I want to maybe pivot here and talk a little bit about resource scarcity, talk a little bit about the supply chain, and a topic we're hearing a lot more about, which is circularity. Right? So there's an element of how do we reuse materials? How do we think about the full life cycle of materials that we use? And it starts with how do we mine for what we need?
Right.
How are we leveraging it in our manufacturing processes? And then what do reuse and recycle programs look like? Can you talk a little bit about the impact that you think circularity has on how we make decisions?
Yeah. So circularity, it's a big word for some people, even for me. Let me kind of decompose that a little bit. Circularity is, I call it the reverse supply chain. Once material is taken out of the earth, let's say it's bauxite, and it becomes copper, and it becomes, something in a piece of metal and switchgear. Switchgear lasts years and years and years and years and years. Eventually, there's an end of life, and you do something with it. Do you throw it in the garbage? Do you put it in the landfill? Or you take it back to the smelter and give it a second life? Circularity is a second, third, fourth life. Once it's out of the ground, you get as much use out of it as possible. And so circularity is a powerful thing. However, it's not an easy thing. Let me use once again a bit of an absurd example. The proverbial putting the toothpaste back in the tube. Right?
Right.
Once it comes out, it's hard to put it back in.
Right.
But you can.
Yeah.
It takes a little bit more energy.
Maybe a little bit more innovation.
A bit more innovation. And there are ways in which you can do that. And so the whole idea of circularity is the simple notion that don't throw anything away. Give it multiple lives as much as possible. So basic examples people can think about. Your food waste.
Yep.
You can compost that in your yard, right? You can plant your vegetables and so forth. Plastics, there's an Italian artist who's making some really cool art. She uses plastic cups and frames them in these nylon kind of thing. And it's just a beautiful thing. Now, that is only a fraction of the amount of plastic we produce, but at least it's an effort. Some years ago, a company had this thing called Just Do One Thing. And the Just Do One Thing encouraged their people to just do one thing to reuse something.
Okay.
Just one thing. And I think the power of that cannot be underestimated, that we give everything a second life.
So there are ways that at Eaton we're doing this today. So when it comes to like circuit breaker refurbishment, or we're thinking about how do we modernize, we talked about modernizing the grid.
Right.
And there are ways where we could look at, okay, we're not going to pull out all of the infrastructure for the grid, but how do we go and refurbish maybe some of those products and give them an extended life?
Yeah. So broadly, we talk about things like, life extension, retrofitting.
Right.
Some people call it remanufacturing, depending on where you sit in the equation. In aerospace, we do a lot of remanufacturing. Aerospace parts, whether it's a titanium alloy, these things are just more precious than gold, so to speak. So the things that we don't throw away, but you have to be very purposeful. And what that means is that you want the waste material or the end of life material to be gathered in a place so everybody knows where it goes, like batteries, so you can pick it up. Otherwise, the entropy, the cost of trying to, find 1,000 or 1,000,000 different batteries in different places, having collection points, doing the marketing, letting people understand that there's beneficial use of these things and that you can put a second life to them. EV batteries, for example, being used to power, backup system, energy storage, and things like that. So the if you open your mind to it, Second life or circularity is humongous. And in some ways, it's probably even more cost effective in terms of efficiency, because the cost of digging something out of the earth, transporting it to a place, doing whatever you do to it, putting it in a smelter,
Right.
getting the thing melted, and so on. If you think about the energy that goes through all of that, once it's out of the earth, you avoid all of that front energy. You simply reuse and reuse and reuse. And that too, by the way, is an example of efficiency.
And when we think about some of those resources that are more scarce, it becomes even more important to be thinking about ways to reuse it. So when it's harder to get some of the minerals that we might need in the future, right? If we're thinking about reuse at the starting point, then we can be smarter about how much of those resources are we going to go mine or we're going to go find.
So again, thankfully, our teams at Eaton, we have a process as part of our pro launch. It's part of our sustainability playbook. And we actually have something called design for environment, or design for assembly, design for end of life, and so forth. And so our engineers start thinking about these things before they even do the design. Obviously, this is for newer stuff we're producing. Legacy product has its own challenges, but we're looking at all of those things as part of our sustainability framework for new product design.
Data is becoming a major driver of sustainability as well, right? If you're not measuring or tracking data, you don't know what problems to solve. Can you talk a little bit about the impact that you think access to data is having on how companies make decisions?
Yeah. Well, look, again, the premise of your question speaks to the answer. Data is so very important in this whole space around energy management. And let me maybe again come up for air a little bit. When you look at climate modeling, right, climate modeling, it's a data-rich science. And whether it's global temperatures or carbon concentrations and all of that is based on some pretty good accounting and data that goes into it. On our side of the equation, there's a greenhouse gas accounting protocol. And we talk about greenhouse gases in scopes. Scope 1 is the emissions you emit directly by burning fuel at a site. Scope 2 is electricity that you purchase that presumably has been burned in a coal-fired plant someplace. And then Scope 3 is all the emissions that come from other things like transportation and so forth.
The supply chain.
The supply chain. And there are scopes, and that's a broad greenhouse gas accounting protocol. Now, let's do a for instance. Let's say you have a home and you have a 2-story home. You sleep upstairs, and your family kind of gathers on the downstairs part, and you want to save energy. Well, you would zone your temperatures. You can lower your temperature downstairs while you sleep and so on. That is an example of data. In the business scale, we do that on a much more significant level. For example, we can identify how much energy we spend on lighting and how much ambient light you need in certain places that are highly trafficked. We can look at variable frequency drives used in motorized equipment. We can look at even something like a security gate, the number of times it opens and so forth. So data is so important in understanding the use pattern and the consumption pattern of energy in a business or a factory or any particular outfit.
And for highlighting where there's waste.
And where there's waste, or where you could trim energy, reduce your temperatures and so forth, put in better equipment. So we generally understand energy to be like the building envelope, whether it's kept cold or hot. We know HVAC or comfort heating. We know for equipment, for specialized equipment, for compressed. So we have algorithms that give us clear data on how a business, a factory, or even an office building behaves, hospitals and so on. Now, beyond all of that, we also, as I mentioned before, the power genome, we can understand the electrical signature of a grid that is performing. And if there's a fault, how quickly do you identify that? Now, Eaton has developed software and solutions that allow our customers to do all of those things, including if there's a fault, how to geofence or isolate or island a property or a grid so that we can control, interferences and those kinds of things, bring a backup power and all of that. Things we talked briefly about energy storage. Whether you're charging your storage batteries or releasing power, that is also data. So data and energy literally go hand in hand. They tell you how energy is behaving, and then they tell you how you might better manage the energy in terms of where you need more of it, less of it, what type of it, and so on. So yeah, I cannot underscore the criticality of data, and that's why we have some experts in our company, again referencing our Center for Intelligent Power and other parts of our businesses that have teams with IT solutions and other things that help our customers. Um, we don't talk much about this anymore, but there was a while we talked about IIoT, the Industrial Internet of Things, having embedded sensors in equipment and things that inform some computer system of the behavior based on data, so we can manage better whatever that asset is producing or doing.
And our Bright Layer digital platform is
That's-
helping us to bring it all together so that we can use that data to help solve customer
Exactly.
problems.
Bright Layer would be sort of I wouldn't say the cream of the crop, but it's certainly
Well, we can say that.
It's the cream of the crop, but it's also the cake
Right.
and the icing and the cream on top of all of that, right? It's the hard stuff, the soft stuff, and everything else.
Right. So one of the things I thought would be interesting to talk about is policy versus the market. So there's a lot of uncertainty in policy around the world as relates to sustainability, but there's a lot more market clarity. Can you talk a little bit about what that means? What investors are looking for, what customers are looking for?
Well, let me answer the question by maybe stepping back a little bit and reflecting on at least the time I've been in this space. Once upon a time, sustainability was a thing for a few people who cared about the earth and green, this and that, and it was a little bit of people who just had a certain affinity for nature, perhaps.
Right.
And then it slowly became a thing where companies talked about corporate and social responsibility. It was a badge of honor that companies did certain things, and they prided themselves of being a leader. And then it became a thing where customers and investors said, hey, this is important. We like companies that behave a certain way. And then that progressed, I'd say, over the last 5 maybe to 7 years into a relatively rigid regulatory framing of sustainability.
Right.
Europe in particular introduced something called the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, CSRD, that demanded companies do certain things in a certain way. And it followed the ESG model I talked about, in fact, the FESG model I talked about. Now, that lasted for a bit. And then we started seeing a divergence in the geopolitical landscape. In the United States, for example, there's been a fair amount of retrenching to sort of back off any guidances on emissions reductions and so forth. Europe was going forward pretty hard. And the EU in particular, through Brussels, had established these timelines where companies had to report based on your size and income and so forth. Asia was somewhat muted, but following what the EU was doing. And Asia learned something powerful, and especially in China. EVs, electrical vehicles, have taken off.
Yeah. And
the consequence for that is improved air quality. It's opened up markets for innovation. There's all kinds of now China-made incredible EVs and so forth. Concurrently, investors were watching the whole process, and investors started assigning, shall we say, an ESG rating to companies.
Right.
The better your rating, the better they thought you were. Now, as this bifurcation, the US retrenching, Europe kind of going forward but slightly muted, Asia accelerating, what has emerged out of this is people know what value is. Sustainability is green. Green is green, so to speak. When you do the right things for a customer, if you're saving money or helping them optimize their energy management, that is seen as a valuable thing.
Right.
And so what happened to Eaton, and I'm proud to say this on our behalf, Investor Business Daily did some analysis last year. This was ostensibly US-based companies, and they looked at the business model, the business performance, financials, and sustainability. And among all the US companies, our very own company, Eaton, was voted number 1. And that is, I think, the spirit of your question, which is people understand that when sustainability is done right, the notion of safety, reliability, efficiency, and effectiveness, these are business propositions.
Right.
As a matter of fact, when I talk to customers, when I'm in front of customers, I do not use the word sustainability. They want the stuff delivered on time, of course. They want it to work. They want it to perform the way they wanted it. And especially when it comes to energy, they want it done right. Now, beyond energy, there are several other things. In the aerospace world, there are materials that we use, anti-corrosion materials. Some of these things can have some pretty substantial toxic behaviors to them, people look at that. They look at customers or companies like Eaton that have better solutions. Even in our switchgear world, we have something called gas insulated switchgear. We use a material that has something like 24,000 times the potency of greenhouse gases. Eaton has been working on solutions that solve that. Solving that means something for our customers. And so people are tuned into these real value adders. So in many ways, when you step back from sustainability, I say green is green. It's good business if you can solve the equation with the right minds and with the right sort of boundaries, time, and shall we say engineering space.
And I just love that broader definition, right? What is sustainable business? I think at the heart of it is, how do you sustain your business? How do you continue to meet customer needs?
Absolutely. Look, it's just in my years of sort of playing this game. By the way, I kind of learned this over, like everybody else, kind of learn as you go.
Yeah.
It's probably the most unique value proposition Eaton has to offer. And so last fall, we had a meeting with our leadership. We have a review process we call the Eaton Sustainability Council. It's chaired by myself and Paolo. And what we presented was that we're going to make sustainability core to our lead for growth, invest for growth, and execute for growth, and try to embed those principles in how we think about leadership, how we think about investment, how we think about execution, and so forth. So it's really a powerful, compelling, in my mind, compelling story that sustainability is good business, but you got to do it right. And it cannot be virtue signaling.
It's
or
not an
greenwashing.
all or nothing proposition.
Yeah. And it's not a cute thing. It's not like, hey, we're going to plant trees. And those things are important. You know,
Right.
Trees have an incredible impact on the global climate, oxygen production, habitats for all kinds of things, and so on.
But it's, how can we be intentional about the decisions that we're making that are going to help drive growth, that are going to help solve customer problems, and we're going to do it in the most efficient, effective, safe, and reliable way possible.
Right. And that's, to me, what sustainability is.
Yep.
Those words.
Absolutely.
Safe, reliable, efficient, effective.
Well, thank you so much for the
Thank you,
conversation
Zari.
today,
This
Harold.
has been a blast.
It was
I
fun.
hope I shared a few things along
You
the
did,
way.
absolutely.
If you want to learn more about how Eaton is helping customers drive sustainable growth, visit us at eaton.com/sustainability.